Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources and the editor-at-large of Corporate Board Member Magazine, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. Today, we've got a very interesting program, and it's titled the NYSE Comptroller's Boardroom Accountability Project 2.0 meets Main Street Investors. And joining me for this exciting give and take is, first of all, to my far right is Michael Garland, who's the Assistant Comptroller for Corporate Governance and Responsible Investment for the Office of the New York Comptroller, Scott M. Stringer. Welcome, Michael. It's a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you, TK.
And joining him is Cindy Fornelli, the Executive Director for the Center of Audit Quality. And obviously, Cindy, welcome back.
Thank you.
So, Mike, no big surprise. People are interested in what you're doing at the Comptroller's office. You've launched this project, like Boardroom Accountability, ratcheting up a little bit of the pressure on companies. You've done a great job with proxy access. Now you're expanding that to include diversity, climate competency, and whatever. So tell us a little bit about why you guys took the next step to the 2.0.
Sure, and let me just step back and put in context. The Boardroom Accountability Project, broadly, I think the context is the evolution in corporate governance over the past decade. The focus has overwhelmingly been on independence in the boardroom and accountability, which I think investors have come to realize are necessary, but they're not necessarily sufficient. And I think there's much more focus today also on board quality. Do you have the right people in the boardroom to oversee strategy and risk? And I think a key part of quality in board composition is diversity. Diversity of perspectives, but explicitly diversity of race and gender. And I think that's a large part about how and why we launched the Boardroom Accountability Project in 2014. That was an effort to enact proxy access as a first step in the US market, going company by company, but with a focus on companies that lacked adequate diversity in the boardroom, that were exposed to risks related to climate change, and that had a history of excessive CEO pay. At the time, 3 years ago, there were 6 companies in the US with proxy access. Today, there are more than 450 companies. And the theory of proxy access is that it will make boards more responsive to investors and to investor concerns, including on issues of board composition. I don't think it's our expectation that proxy access will be used frequently. I think it'll be rarely used, but the specter of proxy access should change board behavior. And so Boardroom 2.0, which we just launched, is really calling the question or testing the theory. And so of the 450 companies in the US that now have proxy access, about a third of those were directly in response to shareholder proposals from New York City. And we've recently sent a letter, the Comptroller Stringer, to those companies, 150 companies, saying we want to engage with your nominating committee. We want to talk to you about board refreshment, board assessment, how you ensure that you have the right mix of skills and experience in the boardroom, how you look for diverse directors. And as a predicate to this discussion, we want you to share with us and to disclose publicly a skills and experience matrix of your board so that investors can get a high-level picture of how the board fits together, where there may be gaps in skills or experience. And we're not being overly prescriptive. The dimensions of that matrix ought to be defined by the board, and they ought to be meaningful. Not every director should have every skill. But there are 2 dimensions of the matrix that we think ought to be included in every matrix, and that's the race and gender, race/ethnicity and gender of the directors, because today investors really don't know I mean, based on names, you can guess with about 98% accuracy gender diversity, but when it comes to race and ethnicity and where the pace of change has been glacial on both counts, we really don't have that information.
So first of all, Michael, the Comptroller's team, a lot of institutional investors talk about change. For good or bad, nobody has promoted change and been successful at it more than the Comptroller's corporate governance team. And again, I don't think that's going to be any different in 2018 as it was in 2017. Now, Cindy, we know that side. Now we got the investor side. The CAQ does a study, it's done it for 11 years, called the Main Street Investor Survey. They sort of look at who they trust, okay, in that. And this, we've seen in our 11 years of this, we've seen the numbers change. But right now, in the latest one, corporate boards, in lack of trust, came in just above government regulators and Congress, okay? Now, there is good news, though, with this. So tell a little bit about the survey results and how it fits into now what you just heard about accountability.
Well, you're exactly right, TK. The board as a whole, historically, has not scored well on this particular question, and that is, of all of those in the system, in our market system, who's tasked with looking out for investors' interests, whom do you trust the most? And the board as a whole the board of directors has this year come in third to the last. And that's very disappointing, but I think it reinforces the notion that the New York Comptroller's Office is looking at, which is how do we help investors know the work that boards of directors do and make sure that boards of directors have those skill sets so that investors will trust them. Because after all, it's the directors who look after the interests of all of the stakeholders, of which investors are a key primary one. Now, there is some good news in that the entities that investors trust the most, coming in number 2, just slightly behind independent auditors, which at the Center for Audit Quality, we were pleased that auditors came in number 1 again this year, but just right behind them are the independent audit committees of publicly traded companies. And so they see the work that the independent audit committee does. They trust the work that the independent audit committee does. And we would like to see that through the work that you all are doing, Mike, and that others in the governance space are doing. We would like to see that transfer over to the board as a whole. And I want to pick up on something else that you said, Mike, which I think is critically important, is we also look at disclosures in a separate survey that we do, or a separate research tool that we use at the CAQ, and it's so important for investors to get that disclosure. Not every investor, particularly the Main Street investor that the survey talks to, has the opportunity to sit down with a large public company. Right? And so the best way for a company to communicate and to interact with their investors is through their disclosures. And so having things in their disclosures, in their proxy statements, or elsewhere in their disclosure regime about the qualifications of the board, right, about how the company is addressing climate risks, how the company is looking at cybersecurity risks. All of these are really important data points for investors. And the easiest, most effective way to do that is through a company's disclosure. So we're very encouraged to see more and more disclosures. Does not take away from some of the other work, but that is the foundation of the pyramid, if you will.
No, that's absolutely right.
I think.
And we engage hundreds of companies. That's a fraction of the companies in our portfolio. We make voting decisions regularly based solely on disclosure. And if a company doesn't provide us the information, it's at a disadvantage. And it's not only the skills and experience, but tying it all together with a narrative. Why do these skills and experience match where the company is going? what's the company's strategy? A lot of that information, to the extent that it exists, is sometimes in the 10K. I would encourage companies to put a little of what is sometimes in the 10K in the proxy statement, because investors like us spend a lot of time with the proxy statement. And
well, disclosures really need to improve, though, because they get so lawyered up, and more disclosures don't help, Mike, if, again, they're managed, okay, in a way. Now, the narrative, what you talked about, I think is good. That's why I think the engagement is so critically important, because a lot of people end up with good disclosures, and that doesn't mean that that's the way they operate. Okay, and that's what worries me about disclosures.
Well, and it's not more disclosure, it's better disclosure, right? And Mike hit on something which I think is really important and that bears repeating, and that is it needs to be tailored disclosure. It's the company's opportunity and the board of directors' opportunity to tell the company's story. Why wouldn't you take advantage of that? Yes, I know that there are legal obligations, and I know that there's litigation fears and risks. I get that. But you can still tell your story and tailor your disclosure year over year over year. And it's going to change year over year over year. As you said, a company's strategy today may change 5 years from now, and so the board skills may change 5 years from now. So just talk about it.
You can have 10 highly skilled individuals in your boardroom who are, could potentially add value in any boardroom, but why those 10 on this board?
At this time.
At this time.
So there's so much that we could talk about. We have about a minute left, and I really wanted, Mike, to get your perspective. Again, you're pushing a lot of things in 2018. What, if you had to identify, for example, in 2017, board composition, which fits into all that you've talked about, was the #1 issue from investors. Will that remain the same in 2018, or is there something new? Cindy, I'd be curious.
Everyone always asks, and the new thing, and I think board quality and composition will remain front and center, and I think we spent some time on that. The other issue is climate change and climate risk. Board oversight, so that it touches on board quality. But I think you saw that in the votes at Exxon and Occidental, majority votes on proposals at those companies, the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. I think investors of all stripes recognize that climate change and regulatory and policy responses create risks and opportunities for companies regardless of your industry. And I think that will continue to be front and center for investors.
I guess my parting point would be there's no need to wait for regulation. Companies should be thinking about this now and should be making those disclosures, whether it's on board composition, on climate risk and climate management, on strategy. Don't wait for regulation. There's no reason that you can't do this now, and a good board will drive that.
That's right, and in fact, I think in a regulatory environment where we're not likely to see more regulation, I think the push from investors is stronger. So the impetus is there.
Well, there's 100 more questions that I'd like to ask, but we're out of time. I want to thank Cindy and Michael for taking the time to join us and giving that insight to board members that are watching out there. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors, Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.